In this video, we're going to learn how to use Python's FastAPI with Azure Functions and Azure Active Directory to create secure serverless APIs. Let's go. Before we get started, two important dependencies that we need to talk about. One is the Azure Function core tools or the CLI tools that allow you to run and develop locally Azure Functions, and the other one is the Python runtime. So if you don't have them, I would urge you to download them so you can follow along in this video. There are three main things that we need to do to create a secure API with FastAPI and Azure Functions. Firstly, we need to create an Azure function that we can work with locally using either the Azure Function core tools or Visual Studio Code. Secondly, we need to create an Azure Active Directory app registration that we can use to issue and validate tokens against. And thirdly, we need to add the necessary code components and dependencies in our function to spin up FastAPI, handle routes, and do the appropriate token validation. We will do all these one step at a time. Okay, first things first, we will create a directory where our Azure function will live. And we can do this from the command line. FastAPI Azure Func. Then we will change directory into our newly created projects. Now we can open this in Visual Studio Code with code dots. Let's drag this to the right window. And in here, we can now create an Azure function. Again, I said we can use the CLI or the Visual Studio Code extension. Here, create new project. Let's close this one. We'll use the current directory. We will use Python. And there is an important dependency here. Azure Functions with Python have a dependency on 3.9, 3.7, 3.8, or 3.9. If you use 3.10, like I was, then the Azure Function core tools will not operate. So you need to pin it to a version that is supported, i.e. 3.9. We will use HTTP trigger because we want to call it over HTTP, and we will give it a name, secure HTTP. It will be anonymous because we don't want functions to authenticate for us. We are going to use Azure Active Directory to do the authentication authorization. And with that, we should get our functions project created soon. You'll see it goes through the steps, creates the virtual environment, and when this one finishes, we should have everything that we need to run the Azure function. With our Azure function created, we can take a quick tour to understand what all these files are doing here. We will start with the requirements.txt, which is where we are going to place all our dependencies. Then we'll jump straight into our function, and the init.py is the entry point for our HTTP-based Azure function. Currently, this is what the standard template generates, but we will come back and change this. And finally, I want to draw your attention to the VS Code folder, where all the configuration files live to allow VS Code to run and debug our Azure function. If you use VS Code to generate the Azure function, as we did, then all these files will be generated for you. However, if you do use the Azure function core tools, then you will have to manually add these files. This may not be as important to you, however, because you may not want to use VS Code to debug and you just want to run through the CLI. That's totally fine. Another nice thing about using VS Code is that it went and generated virtual environment for us and activated. Therefore, we don't really have to do anything other than pressing F5 to run the function, which we will do now. F5. Our Azure function is now actively listening for incoming HTTP calls. Let's go and call it. I like to use ThunderClient because it's a pretty nifty tool. So I will put this here and I will call it. It executed successfully. It was expecting a name. So let's go and add a name parameter and send again. There you go. Success. The first step is done. We have an Azure function written with Python running locally, and we're able to debug as well. Now that we know that our function runs, we can jump to the Azure Active Directory portal to configure our app registrations. We will need two app registrations. One for our API to be able to authenticate and expose API permissions. One for our API to expose the API permissions and validate tokens. And second for our API client to authenticate and acquire an access token for the API. Open the portal in the browser by navigating to aad.portal.azure.com. Here, we need to head out to Azure Active Directory and select App Registration. Click on New Registration, give it a good name, and click Register. The only thing that we need to do here is expose an API. First, set the app ID URI. You can change that if you want to. And next, we need to add a scope. I will name my scope data.read. I will allow admin and users to give consent, and I will give it a description such as read data from the API. I will use copy paste to save time for the rest of the descriptions. And finally, I will click add scope. We need to make a note of this, so make sure to put it somewhere safe. And we also need to capture the application or client ID and the tenant ID. Okay, one down, one to go. Back to the top level, a new registration. Give it a meaningful name again, FastAPI client, and click register. We have a few more steps when it comes to creating the client app. Sometimes when we work with APIs, we don't want to build a full-blown client app just to test the API. In such cases, we can use tools like Postman, which is very, very popular, or something else that works for you. I like to use ThunderClient, which is a VS Code extension. It is very portable and lightweight. This video is not sponsored by ThunderClient, but I'm open to opportunities. Wink, wink. Now back to our app registration. Here we need to set up authentication because we need to be able to authenticate and interact with Azure Active Directory to sign in and get an access token. We will choose accounts in this organization and add a platform. We will use web. Now, very important, we need to set up the redirect URI. And this comes from our ThunderClient. This redirect URI is in effect where Azure Active Directory will send the access tokens back. Press configure. Finally, we need a secret to be able to authenticate. For that, I will create a new secret. I will give it a name, ThunderClient. Leave the default as 6 months and create a secret. Please note that I will be changing this and deleting this app registration later on. These secrets are sensitive information. Consider them as passwords, and therefore they should not fall in the wrong hands. Always protect your secrets, and when possible, use a certificate instead. Before we head out, we need to capture some information. We need the client ID again, we need the tenant ID, and we also need the endpoints, the authorized and token endpoints. They're used by ThunderClient to authenticate and grab access tokens. Let's stop the running app, and here I am going to change some settings. The authorized and token URLs are not going to change because I'm using the same tenant. Same for the callback URI, but we need to add the new client ID for our client. We need to add the new client secret, and we also need to add the scope. Remember, we copied that scope earlier on. This is where it comes very, very handy to have. At this point, we can actually get an access token for our API, even though it's not going to be used anywhere. So let's try this out. Make sure that we have everything correct. Make sure to sign in with the right account. This is positive. It is requiring an access token and consent for our FastAPI. So we'll press accept. And if everything goes correctly, coming back here, we should have the new access token. We can always confirm that by checking the access token in jwt.ms. My name, the right scope, the right audience, which is our API, and the tenant ID, which is the tenant ID that we're using to sign in. The next and final step is to update our Azure function to use FastAPI and the appropriate libraries to validate the incoming tokens. Let's do this. I'm going to leave this open for now, and then in here, we'll start with our dependencies. So we need FastAPI, and we also need FastAPI Microsoft Identity. Back from the command line, let's restore our dependencies. First, let's activate, and then p install requirements. Okay. Then we need to go back into our function and update most of this code. First, we need to add the FastAPI from API import. Initialize our FastAPI, and then update the code below. I also want to add the context here in case we need it. Sweet. Now we also need to create a new directory where our API endpoints are going to live. At the root, let's press directory. Let's name it this routers. And under here, we need to add a new folder called weather.py. Let's open weather.py, import some libraries. So import logging, which is very important. From FastAPI, we want to import router, we want to import request, and we want to import response. And then from our FastAPI Microsoft library, we want to import initialize, we want to import requires auth error, and validate scope. We need to initialize our router, and then we also want to initialize the Microsoft Identity Library. The initialize method takes two properties: the tenant ID, which we have somewhere stored safely from the previous exercise, which is a string, and then we also need to pass the client ID, which is the identifier for our specific app registration. Okay, we have what we need here. Then the next step is to create a routing endpoint. Oh, you know what? We also need an expected scope. Remember we talked about the scope? Here it is the place where we want to declare that, and we will say data.read, because that's what we put in our API. Next, we need to create a new router.get. We'll call it CT for now, and then in here we'll say requires auth. We don't need the expected scope here. Requires auth will check for an access token in the incoming request, and if one exists, it will try to validate it against Azure Active Directory. If there is no token, it will automatically send back a 401 response, which means that the request is unauthenticated. If there is a token and it is valid, it will allow the rest of the process to execute and the code to execute. But if there is a token that is invalid, you will also get a 401 back saying that the token is invalid, could be expired, for example. So here we can say async def get weather. We need to declare a request, and then we want to grab the CT from the incoming request. I like how this works. Okay, cool. So here we want to validate the scope. First, we validate that there's an active and valid access token. Then we validate the scope. And then if we find the right data, we want to return it back to the user. If there is an issue, what we want to do is return a response with the appropriate error message, so we can help the client fix the problem. Now, there are a couple more things that we need to do before we're able to run the application. First, in our host.json, we need to add one setting here, and I will copy paste this. That's for us to be able to route to the appropriate endpoint. And finally, in our main function, we want to update this. And finally, in the main function, we need to declare our route with the appropriate name. Includes router, and then we'll say weather.router, because that's what we declared in our file. And then we can add a prefix as weather. And the thing that is missing here and why weather is not resolving is because we need to import it. And the very last thing that we need to do is in function over here, we need to update the route. Okay, now we can try our function and see what happens. And there you have it. End-to-end security by authenticating the client, acquiring an access token, and calling our function and validating that the token contains the right permissions. We can easily test that and make sure that we have the right permissions here by changing the expected scope and running the function again. If I call the same function now, we should see that we get a 403 back. And as expected, we do not have the right scope here, and that's why it didn't work. If you like this content and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss any updates. But in essence, what we created today was a secure API using Azure Functions, Python, the FastAPI framework, and the FastAPI Microsoft library to put everything together. We also did a little bit of configuration inside Azure Active Directory to set up our authentication and API permissions. You can find more details in the description below, and I'll see you around.